Good evening. I'm Terry Freeman, Executive Director of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture, affectionately known as the Lewis. And I am so happy that you are here with us this evening for what promises to be a very engaging conversation about incredible injustices done in our country and actually around the globe. On March 13th, 2020, shots were fired in Louisville, Kentucky, killing a young woman named Breonna Taylor. She was in her home with her boyfriend, who shot a warning shot in a state that is a stand your ground state. And the only person who was arrested was her boyfriend. And she was murdered by the police officers. No justice has been done in this incident, as you are well aware, as no one has been charged with Ms. Taylor's murder. Unfortunately, this happens far too frequently. And this evening, we're going to talk with an incredible panel to discuss this issue in particular. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Kali-Ahset Amen, and she is an interdisciplinary social scientist, exhibition curator, and organizational strategist. Her scholarship and intellectual activism focus on racism, Black subjectivities, and urban inequalities in Central America and the US South. She is an assistant researcher and professor of sociology and the associate director of the Billie Holiday Project for Liberation Arts at Johns Hopkins University. Previously, Kali-Ahset was associate director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Before we bring on Dr. Amen, we want you to watch a short tribute video.
In memory, we want to say their names. Eleanor Bumper, Gabriela Navarez, Michelle Couzeau, Tanisha Anderson, Janisha Bonville, Megan Hockaday, Alexia Christian, Maya Hall, Natasha McKenna, Kiam Livingston, Miriam Carey, Alberta Spruill, Chantel Davis, Shelley Frey, Kayla Moore, India Cager, Corinne Gaines, Rakia Boyd, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. In memory to all African American women not listed, but who were slain or physically sexually assaulted by law enforcement, we say their name. Ashe.
For the introduction, Terry. I'm glad, on a positive note, to see you taking the helm at the Lewis Museum. Those out there listening who don't know this woman's background in the museum world, take a good look. She's the real deal. We're all excited for you. And I'm definitely grateful to be here. It is truly important to me, and dare I say to all the women on this panel, to be a part of this remembrance of Breonna, this tribute to her and the many more Black women who have unfortunately suffered a fate like hers. It's personally very meaningful to be able to engage in this crucial reflection among you, other members of our community who are deeply concerned about finding remedies to some of the most difficult aspects of living as a woman of African descent in these United States. The difficulty of staying free in the face of a relentless political and corporate machinery that seeks aggressively to incarcerate us. As we know, there are more Black men in jail, but the rates of Black women's imprisonment has grown exponentially since the 1980s. Then there is the difficulty of feeling safe physically and emotionally in public as well as in private, whether we are talking about the birthing room and the bedroom or the workplace and the street. And of course, the difficulty of just staying alive in the face of multiple forces that militate against our being here. In a nutshell, the difficulty of being Black and woman at the same time. And I say that not in the spirit of competition with any other group's struggle, especially our men, but rather as a vital recognition of the particularities of the Black woman's struggle and the specific violences we face historically and presently. So one of the things we want to talk about today is the fact that these things are often not talked about. Breonna is our sister, and we're here to lift up her name and all of our sisters, and to speak candidly this evening about the stakes of remaining silent concerning the very real peril of police violence that Black women and girls endure. And on that note, I am pleased to introduce our experts. Dr. Kimberly R. Moffitt is Interim Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, a professor of language, literacy, and culture, and affiliate professor of Africana Studies at UMBC. Her teaching interests include culture, media studies, criticism, Black hair and body politics, sports and media, and popular culture. Dr. Vesla Mae Weaver is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University and a 2016-2017 Andrew Carnegie Fellow. She's contributed to scholarly debates around the persistence of racial inequality, colorism in the United States, the causes and consequences of the dramatic rise in prisons, and the consequences of rising economic polarization. And Tenjiwe McHarris is currently in leadership within the Movement for Black Lives and is the co-founder of Blackbird, an organization that focuses on movement building in this current historical moment. She honed her human rights campaign development and organizing skills while working for and movement building with collectives and international organizations over the past 15 years. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for your dedicated work. And to get our discussion underway, I kind of want to walk us backwards through time, starting with an understanding of where we are today in terms of the realities of police brutality against Black women, and then reach back into the history to understand how we got here. And then we'll circle back to connect the dots on how to move forward to protect Black women and advocate for justice. All right, and a quick note to the audience, the panelists will say their piece or questions in the chat throughout. First things first, let's take a quick moment to recall where things stand with Breonna Taylor's case and the pursuit of justice on her behalf. Now, as we heard in the opening of this program, in 2020, it was announced that the police officers who shot her would not be indicted on any charges related to her death. Now, there are a number of groups, including the NAACP and others, they're calling on the Kentucky Attorney General's office to appoint a special prosecutor to resubmit the case to a grand jury and present additional evidence. And Breonna's family has been pushing for criminal charges. And Louisville officials recently agreed, well, maybe not so recently, to pay $12 million to settle a wrongful death lawsuit brought by her mother. But there's lots more work to be done. I want to direct this first question to Tenjiwe. Now, you've been on the front lines as an organizer and a strategist for a very long time. There have been a lot of high-profile cases of Black people, men especially, killed by police. Why do you think Breonna's case became one of those high-profile cases, while other instances involving the women's names we called earlier never surfaced?
Sure, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You know, I think well, first, thank you for holding this and moderating, and I just appreciate you all for having this discussion. I think it's a very important one. And I think a number of factors took place, but I think at the heart of it is that people demanded it, demanded that we don't forget the name of Breonna Taylor, demanded that we center her life and what happened to her and not erase it within sort of the growing discourse around state violence and police violence. And the truth is that when we look at the history of Black people who have been killed by the police, Black people who have been harmed and assaulted by the police, we see a long history of family members, of folks from the community that have demanded justice from their justice for their loved ones, and often demanding for structural change as well. And I think in that moment what we had is, it was, you know, in the heels of the pandemic, where we're dealing with massive suffering and government failure. You had the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and uprisings across the country, and then you had this moment where people really demanding that we do not erase Black women from the conversation around state violence, police violence, economic violence, all of that. And I just want to say, you know, it's really sad that we even have to say we're not in competition with other folks within our community. Of course we're not. Every death, every assault, every harm that comes to any one of our people should be met with uprising and resistance without question. And what this is about is, how do we make sure that in the midst of our resistance, in the midst of us talking about the building of Black power and structural change, that we make sure that we center the lives of Black women. And I just want to say, this is, I'm sure we're going to talk about it, but at the root of this is obviously the devaluing of Black women. We can't talk about white supremacy without understanding patriarchy and the way capitalism works. And the fact is, we don't talk enough about patriarchy. We don't talk enough about misogyny, and misogynoir in particular. And so it's the act of devaluing of Black women. And then second, I think that we have oftentimes narrow understandings and definitions of violence and harm that often comes from a lens that doesn't have an analysis around misogyny and patriarchy, and often violence looks this way, doesn't look this way. And that's why we don't often talk about the prevalence of sexual assault against Black women. And we don't talk about other forms of violence against Black women that are violent, from the way Black women are treated in terms of economic violence, to various forms of violence that happens to the lives of Black women around the world. And then last, I just want to say, we can't ignore the fact that we have normalized and desensitized ourselves and society towards the harm that happens to Black women. And you can't talk about violence against Black women by the state without talking about other forms of violence of Black women that happens you know, in our homes, in our communities. And so there's ways in which all of a sudden Black women are not supposed to, like, there's the hyper desensitization, but also the normalization of harm against Black women has really impacted the inability to see Black women, honestly, as victims and survivors of multiple forms of violence.
Kimberly, to many of the points that Tenjiwe, you know, just named, take us a little deeper in terms of thinking about how Breonna's case was handled and framed by the media, right? And the ways in which those framings are informed by a long-standing devaluation of Black women.
Yeah, they are not done in a vacuum. And I think that sometimes we do believe that these cases are just existing of their own and don't play a much larger part in historically how we have engaged or not engaged Black women. And I would say in many respects, that turns up to be a level of invisibility about Black women, that we don't really pay attention to what their plight is or what their journey is. We, in fact, it works against us in many ways as Black women that we have this image of being such strong beings that are able to endure quite a bit. And at the same time, when we need help or are in need of support, it's not necessarily there because people assume that we're okay and that we're able to do for ourselves. And so in many respects, the media only plays on those very tropes that we have, embodied ourselves or even just been perpetuated over time. And we find ourselves constantly battling or trying to fight against that particular narrative that leaves us out of being people that need to be cared for or protected or supported in many ways. And what I would say is that, as much as we can look to the media and talk about all of the horrible things that they do in terms of putting that upon us, that we also have to look internally too and think about the ways in which we've been complicit in that process, right? The way in which we talk about other Black women as being strong or able to endure or able to be stoic enough to survive, that we don't give ourselves enough grace. And so how then do we turn around and look at media having an expectation of someone outside of the community giving us that same grace? But the problem is, with all of that being said, that the media is definitely a part of the problem in conveying much of what we understand about ourselves and how others understand us. And so what we see then is we get reified when it's in the 80s and Reagan with the welfare queen, or we get reified even as recently as the Baltimore uprising, where so many folks celebrated the mom who was attacking her son for being out there in the midst of the uprising when it first started out of near Mondawmin Mall, that becomes focal points of how we want to characterize and position women without giving them the space to actually be full human beings with a range of who we are and what we have to offer a society. And so with that, we then find ourselves dealing with representations that constantly negate our full essence and constantly erode us to invisibility so that we don't even show up as being significant beings when we're having conversations about police brutality. Like Sandra Bland should not have existed or occurred in order for us to, have these types of conversations, because her presence as a human being should have been enough for us to respond to. It shouldn't be the fact that she seemed to stand out to us in particular ways that we then rallied around her case. All of these cases matter, but what we have done in media is only sensationalize some and allowed others to fall under the radar. And as long as we don't say anything about it, then what we see is the media not enforcing it either.
Too true. These tropes are very old. They have their real world consequences. They have policy consequences. Right, and these long roots of these particular framings of Black woman's strength, Black woman's sexuality, are rooted in the violence of slavery, which compounded the violences of enslavement and psychological trauma and sexual assault, many of the complexities that Tenjiwe was talking about, right? And even after slavery, of course, the state was implicated in the proliferation of convict labor, the national scourge of lynching. All of these systems touched Black women's lives significantly and extensively. But again, we don't talk about it. Vesla, can you give us a sense of this whole through line, right, that connects state violence against Black women in the past to what we are still witnessing today?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to my co-panelists and to Terry Taylor for organizing this. It gave me a chance to think about this moment, to link current state violence against Black women and girls to the past, and to think through its incredible staying power across generations, time, region. Policing has been the central machinery of racial repression in this country for generations. It's one of the longest standing arrangements upholding racial hierarchy. And so over the past couple years, myself and my colleagues at Yale have established what we think is the largest archive of policing narratives by those who are policed to date. And we listened hard to the testimonies of many Black women and paired them with oral histories, memoirs, newspaper accounts, affidavits, commission reports to help unearth this kind of collective portrait of the experience of being policed. And this collection represents hundreds of thousands of pages of collected oral histories in Black communities. And once we did this mapping, we were struck by just how enduring, how remarkably persistent and consistent the experience of racialized policing has been, or what we have termed a condition of racially authoritarian governance. You only need to sit with these transcripts for a day to discern the sustained pattern of violence and repression that violates democratic norms that have constructed Black women's citizenship. And the patterns we were starting to unearth in the 1930s were reproduced and renewed over time. So sassing police in Forest City, Arkansas in the 1930s becomes resisting arrest or disturbing the peace. Now, the archives are difficult to summarize, but I want to read a few today. They depict how effortful it was for Black young women to avoid police sight, to avoid the gaze of the state. Their labors as mothers to protect their children, their bodies assaulted through regular police procedures like cavity searches, degrading questions hurled at them by police asking if they're prostitutes, if they donned a sexy dress, being arrested for wearing shorts, which was illegal in some places of the Jim Crow South, and not being able to claim state protection in the most long-standing democracy, to claim protection from victimization, because when they called police, they so often ended up being treated as suspects. They show the reach of police and surveillance into places of leisure and play, churches, but ambivalence to their serious victimization or domestic assault. So a bit of a trigger warning. Some of these histories are graphic. They are firsthand witness testimony, and so I don't sugarcoat them or misrepresent their actual verbiage. The first one reads, I am a Negro, 21 years old. On February 6, 1962, when I was 19, I was walking with a young man down a Clarksdale street when Clarksdale police officers, and she names them, stopped us and accused me of having been involved in a theft. I was taken to jail by the officers and they forced me to unclothe and lie on my back. One of the officers beat me between my legs with a belt. A few minutes later, the other officer began to beat me across my naked breasts. The affidavit was signed in 1964 by Bessie Turner. Turner joined 257 other Black Mississippians in 1964 who wrote their stories down at incredible danger to themselves, describing in detail the events leading up to and the actual experience of state violence. They were originally collected to seek federal emergency relief from local government brutality. Bessie Turner's very terse recollection of being battered on one's breasts is joined by other acts of sexual violence by official authorities across our loosely accumulated archive. It shows up as an officer calling out to a young teen enjoying a night out with friends, "Are you a prostitute?" It wends its way through the cavity searches and threats of cavity searches in Portal's narratives. The woman who mentions in passing that her firstborn was the product of a rape by a Baltimore police officer. The HIV positive woman with her medicine in her pocket told that if she informed on her dealer, the officer would force her to give him oral sex. And it finds a girl waiting for her bus to church in Texas. As the interview comes to a close, her name is Ferdy Walker. She calls up a memory of being a young schoolgirl waiting on the bus. She says, one really harassing kind of thing that I went through, and at that time, I was 11 years old, and I will never forget it. I used to go back and forth to church on Sunday afternoons to the United Methodist Youth Group, and I always rode the bus. And you had to stand on the corner, which was about 2 blocks from my house, to catch the bus. And the policemen, in those days, all police people were white, and all bus drivers were white. And those policemen would harass me as I was standing on this corner waiting for the bus to come. And sometimes the two of them would drive up, the bus stop was up high and the street was down low. And they'd drive up under there and they'd expose themselves. And the interviewer asks, who, the policeman? Yes, while I was standing there. And it just really scared me to death. And the only reason I did not go home at that time was because if I had gone home, my mother would have made me stay. And she goes on to say, he always stopped there and I'd get on the bus, but it was these same cops. So I had a morbid fear of policemen all of my life, and it has not completely gone away. But, and this was in the broad open daylight with the sun shining, but I will never forget it, and it always comes back to me every time I get in a really tight experience. That was really bad, and it was bad for all Black girls, And she goes on to say that she becomes a social worker, a nurse for the city of Topeka later in her life, and and this is a theme I want to come back to later. That political socialization at 11 years old was so strong, so strongly shaped the way that she moved through life, that when confronted with child abuse, she would never call the police. She would call ministers, she would look to civic leaders, she would get others involved, but never the police. And I could read more, and I think I'll stop here, and maybe we can come back to some of the more present day narratives that we've collected. But the idea of girlhood being constructed by police encounters, very common theme, maternal authority being circumscribed by police behavior, mothers not being able to protect their young daughters and young sons, the invisibility comes to mind over and over again. The habits that Black girls develop to negotiate and navigate police interactions, the way they carry their book bags, the streets they decide to avoid, and so on and so forth. I'll stop there, but hopefully I'll come back to some of the narratives.
Oh, thank you. No, clearly, I mean, the effects are wide-ranging and affect us over a complete lifetime. I would like to invite the other panelists perhaps to respond to some of these powerful testimonies. But first, Vesla, tell us where we can read more of these or listen to the oral testimonies ourselves.
Well, that is, I'm writing a book called The State from Below, but what's crazy is a lot of these testimonies, and this speaks to your theme of invisibility and sort of recognition. A lot of these testimonies were in our public documents. One of the first that I was reading from is the Mississippi Black Paper, and this has almost never been cited, right? Many of these narratives have been sort of lost in the archive, and they're available. So the Kerner Commission goes and interviews and collects interviews in its field team reports, right? Every single major rebellion against police authority had an associated commission where they often went and interviewed and collected the oral histories. And what's so crazy to me in these oral histories is how often you will have people who were police officers themselves being policed when they're off the clock, right? The number of times that I would see the same kind of story, and you could, you weren't even necessarily able to guess whether you were reading something from present day or from the past. How many of the women in the slideshow that you showed at the beginning were murdered by police in the presence, in front of their children, in front of very young children. So, India Kager's mother, who jumps to guard her young child, her 4-month-old baby. when Virginia Beach police, spatter 51 bullets on her car, and shield the life of her young child, her life is taken.
Yes.
And I think that's missing from this as well, is that this is constructing the experience and expendability of motherhood.
Absolutely, and it brings us full circle to that really powerful point that Kimberly introduced at the very beginning, that all of this really goes back to the way in which Black humanity is valued or devalued, I should say. I want to draw the other speakers in, and again, listening to the testimony reminds me yet again, police officers today continue to associate Black women with criminality and over-police them, and more than that, Black women in police custody experience rape and sexual assault, and this is a big problem. Tenjiwe, I understand that some of your efforts have been devoted to shining a light on this.
I feel like I just want to say, I feel like I'm a constant student of how to show up for my people in ways that are significant. And I think about like all the things that we're fighting, and how to make sure that Black women don't get erased, but Black trans women, Black children, that we're making sure that we're building movements and resistance that are speaking to all the ways in which Black people are harmed. And also I feel like I come on the legacy of Black women that came before me that understood the significance of making sure Black women were not erased, were not invisibilized, but also understanding that if we erase Black women from the ways in which harm and violence happens to our communities, that we will actually never deal with the issue of white supremacy, of capitalism, because inherent to all of that is we need to understand how society is gendered and the role of patriarchy. So both both sort of coming on the heels of, I come off the traditional heels of Black women before me, but also in my own analysis tells me that you actually can't dismantle any of these systems if you don't have a clear and strong analysis around patriarchy and sexism, and that understanding the ways in which lives are valued and lives are also sorted for the purposes of control and maintaining power. And some of the work that I've done in the past, and also I'm just like moved by what was shared earlier in terms of the testimony and thinking about the stories that I've heard, or even the things that I've witnessed. So that's all just sitting in my body right now. Just wanted to say that. But in terms of some of the work that some of us have done in the past, and I do think about Say Her Name, and I wasn't involved in the report, but I was involved in the sort of the effort or campaign, particularly around this moment of like powerful Black protests that was happening across the country. And in the midst of that, we weren't really talking about Black women that were killed by police violence. And one of the Black women that there was a particularly active situation and case around was Rekia Boyd's case, who had died years before, and the case was active at the time of the Say Her Name campaign. And it was about the fact that Say Her Name was exactly what it is. It's like we have to say the names of Black women who are being killed, who are being violated, and really force it. And obviously we have a long way to go. I mean, we still don't. And we still don't see the same level of sort of outrage or protest or uprising to the death of Black women than we do have to the death of Black men. And I think it's important for us, and what was said earlier is so important. We have to dismantle the structures that make this so. We have to like address the systems that make this so. But we won't be able to do any of that if we actually don't deal with how a lot of this informs us as individuals and how we react and how we respond and how we value some lives over the other. And I think that there's, I think in terms of movement work in general, we have to do two things at the same time. We have to deal with the state and how the state is organized. And then we also have to deal with how do we make us the best that we can be so that we can be as powerful as necessary in order to address and deal with what needs to be either dismantled or transformed. So there's just like a lot of work that we need to do, and that sits with me quite a bit, because how can you not be moved by some of these testimonies? How can you not be moved by the suffering of Black women, of Black girls? How can you not be outraged by the killing, by the violence, by the assault? Like, how can you not? And I think that there's something that needs to be awoken across us in a way that allows us to sort of react and respond with just as much outrage, just as much, rigor and passion and love. At the end of the day, it's love. It's like, who do you value is a sign of who you love. I think we just have a lot of work to do.
Kimberly,
Yes, I'd like to. So much is running through my head, but I will first respond by talking about how Black bodies in general are oftentimes both revered and reviled all at the same time. So that one body is occupying or embodying all of that in one interaction. So we can think about, to use examples, we can think about Serena Williams, right? Revered for all that she can accomplish on the tennis court, right? We celebrate her, she's noted, we acknowledge it, but at the same time, look at how easily we will revile her by denigrating her, by referring to her body type, the outfits that she wears, the life choices and decisions that she's made. All of that is occupied and rounded up in one body. And we see this time and time again across Black bodies, so Black men and women. But I think what's interesting about Black women is then when we add in the invisibility piece to this, right, where we find ourselves not engaging or dealing with their humanity, that we see them as just these beings that we can revere and revile, but we don't deal with them in their full essence, and it makes it very easy to hear the types of stories that Vesla is sharing and then think about not doing something about it. And again, that's across the board. That's not specific to what's happening with white supremacy or those who occupy whiteness, but it's also those of us who are in Black bodies who have bought into white supremacy and find ourselves responding to Black bodies in the same way. And so this is across the board in terms of how we are responding to Black women and in their bodies, but there is an issue in terms of where do we take this next? How do we move forward so that we're doing something very different? And so again, we can think about all of these moments where we've talked about Say Her Name that have given us these little micro moments of bubbling up and there being something exciting that can happen in terms of talking about and making sure our stories are being heard. But there's something about what we see happening with Black men that always seems to take precedence over that. So then we aren't talking as much about Breonna Taylor as much as we're talking about George Floyd. And again, just as my co-panelists have said, this isn't about competition. It's about recognizing that our humanity matters, regardless of if it's male or female. It matters. And the fact that we're not choosing to deal with it means that there's something else that we need to be doing ourselves.
So Vesla, how do we begin to pull those pieces together and develop, a sustained program that centers Black women, or, a long, a reprogramming within the Black community to think differently about these problems, to think intersectionally about these issues? Where do we begin? What are you learning from your research?
I think, even as I came here today, there is this tendency in journalistic circles, in academic circles, in policy circles, to kind of play the oppression Olympics. Well, I've seen whole academic articles that justify the erasure of Black women, of Indigenous women, of Asian American women, of Latinas from their analyses, based on trite explanations of, well, we don't have enough data for, or our sample wasn't big enough for them, or police encounters with women are too low so that we couldn't get an adequate, we didn't have statistical power, right? And it is true. I mean, if I showed you my own, analyses in the same communities, in highly policed communities, the share of men that have over 7 encounters with police is over half, right? The share of Black men. And among Black women, it's the opposite, right? Over half have no encounters. So we should acknowledge that, right? We should acknowledge that there is a very real race and gendered interaction in the frequency of police encounters, okay, that is very divergent across gender. However, while recognizing that, we also need to recognize, right? I was just reading a transcript over a woman who was thrown up against the wall. The police officer mistakes her for a man, and there's also that tendency, you know, police officers don't let Black people be kids, and they don't let Black women hold on to their femininity, right? They masculinize, which leads to Black women undertaking all kinds of performances, right? Getting out their lipstick. We see this in our transcripts over and over and over again to try to signal to police officers, right? Look at how disgusting that is. To lay claim to one's body, one has to signal that they are a vulnerable little woman, right? And not a man, right? So she's trying to signal that. She's thrown up against the wall anyways, and the officer is patting her down immediately before even looking in her face. And she says, I want a girl, meaning, you know, I want a woman police officer. And he steps back and he's already patted her breasts, right? And he says, oh, I didn't know you were a girl. And she says, you knew that when you felt my breasts, okay? This comes back to the point that when you ask, well, what should we be doing, right? Policy-wise, it's ridiculous that it took many jurisdictions a long time before they even required that a woman officer would have to be present before somebody could be patted, before a woman could be patted down, right? Those kinds of things, even though the frequencies are different, as I mentioned, the experience is going to be different for a woman. And so we need to be, you know, what we really need to be asking is how do we develop practices that acknowledge that race and gender intersection? What we really need to be asking is what explains why racially and gendered repressive policing has survived every single global moment and movement to reform it, right? Every moment of reform has yielded us, has birthed almost the exact same policy regime, right? If anything, it's kind of given greater legitimacy to greater police manpower and incursions into Black communities. What explains the incredible endurance of authoritarian patterns of policing within one of the world's oldest democracies and most celebrated democracy? And I think something that is recurrent in this conversation is not just state violence, not just structural violence, but epistemic violence, right? The discounting of Black women's experiences, the discounting of routine humiliation and suspicions and being made suspicious by the media, by policymakers, and even academics who tend to write and theorize and depict and to design policy from a very gendered perspective, and who continue to isolate questions of policing from Black womanhood and Black woman's citizenship, and vulnerability to all forms of violence.
Mm-hmm. And this is precisely why this conversation is so absolutely necessary, and not just during Women's Month, and not just during Black History Month. We got to keep having this conversation. I want to turn it over now to the audience for questions that I'm sure folks have been holding on to for a while. Our panelists have a wide-ranging and deep expertise. So Terry, if you will read aloud some of the selected questions.
Sure. Okay, we have several. First one, how do we bring an end to victim shaming? When we Black women speak out, we are subject to blaming, shaming, or other things instead of being supported in the situation.
I think that's open to anyone, whoever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I was just listening to an interview with one of the mothers of women slain by police, India Kager, and the interview is harrowing because she depicts all of the shaming that she received after, right? All of the questioning. Well, why was your daughter riding in the car with this, criminal suspect? Didn't she know better? Why was she driving that late at night? Why birds of a feather go together, right? Rather than the support. And she recollects even being in rooms of other parents of slain Black men. She felt erased. She felt put to the sideline. She felt like, well, I'm the mother of a daughter. My story is episodic. It's not the kind of crux of the movement, the way the slain men are, with no disrespect to them. And it was so painful to listen to her erasure by the police force. She talks about how in the aftermath, she's not allowed to see her daughter. She's not allowed to collect her belongings. She's charged. She's sent a bill by the city for removing the car, right? She's actually billed for it and is never given closure. As so many, I haven't done the statistics here, but I would hazard a guess that most of the women that were killed brutally by police in that opening slideshow did not result in convicted and jailed officers, right? That is a pattern that has been so present we need to actually name it. But the ways in which she was humiliated and further erased by her treatment, when they would talk about, well, the police officers are going to need to go through therapy, rather than mentioning the harm done to her and her family, right? And in many of the cases, right, whether it be Rakia Boyd or Corin Gaines or Natasha McKenna, the way that the mothers, the way that the families were treated as disposable, as suspicious, as questionable, rather than as victims of patterned and predictable state violence that is longstanding and has historical precedent. They describe having no redress, no recourse, no voice, regularly sidelined in policy reform discussions, right? So we all know the chant, say her name, but even I was embarrassed at how many of those women's names I maybe recognized but couldn't call out on my own, right? We need to collectively, as a society, understand why that is. Why is it that do we believe that their stories are less meaningful, are particularistic, rather than central to the story of America? What is it?
Well, I'm going to make a plug right here and now as a member of the Baltimore community, a plug to the Reginald Lewis Museum to create a place of honor and visibility for these women's names in the museum. We need to memorialize them and make it a part of our everyday habit. And we've got to get that book when it comes out, Vesla. We have about 10 minutes left. Terry, do you think we can get 2 or 3 more questions in for the other panelists? Wonderful.
Yeah.
So maybe give us 2 questions and they can figure out how to respond.
Okay. one of the questions is, if we build coalition and ally with groups like the African American Policy Forum, will we have access to critical policy data and projects which impacts the erasure and invisibility of Black female lives? And another question was in reference to, my question for the panel: what guidance would this panel offer Black men on how to support breaking down the patriarchy and provide increased support for Black women in society and corporate environments when they may feel somewhat powerless in the same spaces?
Oh, this group is ready to jump on those questions. Kimberly.
I was trying to contain myself. I think some of it, and it doesn't sound so academic, but some of it is just being able to check other brothers, and making sure that they understand the role that they're playing in terms of patriarchy and sexism. We have spent in our communities so much time having to deal with the racial violence that our bodies have had to endure over generations, over centuries, that it's sometimes difficult to shift that conversation to also include issues of patriarchy and sexism. And so while we have our partners, our male partners, or we have our brothers and our fathers that are there, they too have been a part of a system that has told them to privilege one body over another, and that body has often been male. And so at the same time, it is important for our men, our family members, our male family members, to also be connected to this journey and experience, and not just in the role of, oh, I have to protect my daughter, but I have to protect all who are Black and female in my community, and recognize that we have been a part of some of what we have done to our community, to our women, by participating and being so complicit in patriarchy and sexism. So for me, it comes down to something very basic. Well, as we are learning more about the role of patriarchy and sexism, then we too should teach others. And one way in which to teach others is to check them on some of what they have been exhibiting in our community.
Just amen to that. I mean, I would say a few things, and I feel like you just captured it so well. But to study, I mean, all of us are required to study, and there's different ways to study and to understand patriarchy. To be willing to receive and to learn, and to listen. In addition to studying, everybody has folks around them who have been suffering, and you have been present for it. And there's a ways in which we need more of our people to listen, and to acknowledge, and to be willing to open up and learn. And the other piece is there's no way we're going to be able to deal with the structural issue of patriarchy if we don't deal with the ways patriarchy is showing up in our individual and interpersonal lives. There's no way we can stop the killing of the Breonna Taylors. There's no way we're going to stop the sexual assault by police officers if we don't deal with sexual assault and domestic violence within our own communities. And so we actually need to do some really powerful, bold, courageous work within our community so we can be the kind of strong, powerful force we need to be to take on the structures that are harming our people.
And if I can add to that, because I think Tenjue is right on point, that some of this also means that we have to deal with the generational shifts that are happening, right? That this can't be just me talking to my my partner. This also has to be my partner being able to communicate to our son how he is supposed to treat women, how he is supposed to protect women, how he is supposed to protect his sister so that she is not a victim of these types of atrocities. And that's the piece where I think sometimes is very much disconnected for us in terms of dealing with patriarchy and sexism, is that we see it as very much about the adults or the generation that we are focused on, but we're not having these conversations with those that come after us to make sure that they too are receiving the messages of what is necessary in order to address these types of issues. issues. And unless we do, then what we find ourselves dealing with are 16-year-olds who sound like 55-year-olds and are still speaking the same type of patriarchy and sexism that they too were taught. And so while we are learning, unfolding, understanding more about ourselves, we need to be teaching that to the younger generations as well.
Now I want to jump in again.
Well, I do want to register. We did have another question, if anybody sort of wants to touch on that, about sort of building up our organizational infrastructure and allying with existing organizations to move forward this work. But go ahead, Tenjue.
And I would say, and I'd let other folks say that, I feel like what was said was so important. And I also just want to be clear even about my understanding that we need to deal with so many things, patriarchal violence essentially within our communities. And also to be clear, I'm an abolitionist. I believe that we not only need to defund and divest from policing and prisons, that we need to abolish them, and they don't serve to protect or support our people. And so we understand that these systems don't work. And in fact, when we have violence within our communities, while there are ways in which community members are finding out ways to respond to the needs of our people, we essentially have a system of policing that provides more harm than it does any sense of safety. And so it's actually, for me, when I think about sort of moving towards an alternative vision where we have actual safety or mechanisms for safety for our people, where we have a restructuring of the economy, we actually need to do the hard, meaningful, very difficult work amongst us to build beautiful Black community, and so that we can also build beautiful, powerful, sharp, and clear Black movement that can not just like dismantle systems, but that can also build the alternatives that we need.
And to segue into this other question that you raised, I think the way in which we can build those types of movements has a lot to, and the connections between organizations has a lot to still deal with around patriarchy and sexism. That when we look at even the conversations around the civil rights movement versus the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot in which we recognize the role in which male figures have played in one versus another, and the tension or rub that exists between those movements because we are used to or expect a male figure to play a particular role. But we know the amount of work that is being done by women in the Black Lives Matter movement, and that has to be dealt with in order for us to then coalesce all of these organizations so that we can do the type of movements that Tanjue is talking about.
Well, audience, I hoped to get some more questions in from you, but we have a lively and wise bunch here. So before I turn the mic back over to our fearless leader, Terry Freeman, Vesla, last words from you.
Well, those were great points, Kimberly and Tenjue. I don't have too much to add, but I do think I would end on an optimistic note. I think part of the reason why we saw Say Her Name was because of Black woman-led and LGBTQ-led structures and movements that did not hold up the kind of singular Black male messiah figure, right? And really grappled with, and I love the organization that the person that asking the question pointed out, AAPF, is centrally, right? Kimberly Crenshaw is like the mother of intersectionality, and the discussions on that forum have really advanced and sort of transformed the way we talk about Black women and policing and COVID and structural racism and state violence, and in ways that I think are finally breathing new air and new life into the way we talk about these issues. I mean, when I was talking to Terry Taylor earlier, I was recalling how one of the questions is sort of around, well, why has Black victimization been so, Black women's victimization by police been so invisible and erased? And I think it's a long-standing history. I mean, MLK's mother, most people don't realize this, was assassinated 6 years after her son, right? We never talk about that. We do not hold up her name. You will not read that in history texts taught to young school kids. And I think that is changing, and that's my optimistic ending, is that I do think finally we are seeing the burgeoning of a new paradigm in which that erasure really has no place.
Good, and we have to lift it up. I want to thank all of you here for being present, and I'm going to turn the mic back over to Terry Freeman.
Thank you so much. And I want the audience to just join me in also thanking Dr. Amen, Ms. McHarris, Dr. Weaver, and Dr. Moffitt for this incredible conversation. A couple of thoughts, though, as you all were speaking. The first is that when you first started this conversation, you were talking about this image that, in fact, we perpetuate about Black women. And the first thing that popped into my head was a song that I think came out in the 80s, probably before some of you were born, called Superwoman by Karen White. And this whole idea that we don't have to be superwomen. But in many instances, that's not the message that we even send to our own daughters. In fact, we tell our daughters sometimes that we do have to be superwomen. So that was one of the first things that came to mind. And then the second thing that I was thinking about was this incredibly long tail that slavery has, and the hold that it has had on our people for so long because of the roots of the entanglement, if you will, that it has had with Black people and the issues that it has created for us, as we try to sometimes not even acknowledge that it happened. But it has an incredible long tail. And as you were talking about the women who have been victimized, some of the people in the audience know that I came here from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. And one of my favorite stories, as harrowing as it was that of Fannie Lou Hamer. Because Fannie Lou Hamer was one of those women in Mississippi who went to vote and was assaulted and beaten by many police officers because she wanted to exercise her right to vote. But she didn't let that deter her from continuing to push forward. And to hear her tell her story on the congressional floor, if you haven't heard it, you need to find that clip, because it is incredibly harrowing to see this woman tell this terrible story about what was done to her, but she pushed forward for the greater good and for the benefit of all of her people. And Dr. Amen, I heard your charge to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, and we will see what we can do about that. But I want to end on that note, actually, that museums are here so that we can have these conversations. It's nice to go into a museum and see artifacts and see pretty pictures on the wall, but that's not the role of the 21st century museum. That's a part of the role. And so for us to be able to continue to do these sorts of programs, we need the support of our community. It doesn't get done without some resources. So I ask all of the audience, if you are members to the Lewis, I thank you for your membership. I ask that you will renew it. If you are not a member, I ask that you become a member of the Lewis. And I can promise you that we will continue to bring you outstanding programming and incredible women like those who have been presented before you this evening to talk about topics that are incredibly relevant, timely, and critical for us to talk about, but then to also do something about. So I thank you all this evening for being with us. I hope you will join us again for future programs, and to our audience, thank you for being here with us this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you.